So the goal of the second speech is to go out, research, discover quality information that you can share with your audience about a certain subject. And so in order to do that, of course, you're going to need a lot of tools to help you do that gathering and then to evaluate the sources for their qualities. One of the tools that I'd like you to know, and that's very common in academic research that we use to determine the different types of sources, are the concepts of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. So I'd like to give a quick kind of overview of these, some of the relative strengths and weaknesses of these different kinds of sources, and then talk through a scenario that you might encounter where you can apply this tool to help you understand what it is you're doing and think about how you can go about giving credit to the sources of the information that you're using in your speeches. Okay, so let's take a look at what primary, secondary, and tertiary sources are. So here you see an infographic that details the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources of information. I got this from Wichita State Library, and you can find a link to it on the page that houses this video. If you take a look at the arrow at the top, it kind of sums up the big differences between these three categories, which is as you move away from primary sources of information, you are getting further and further away from the original source of the information. And the bottom arrow also kind of demonstrates that what we're doing when we're doing research is we are digging further and further into the past and trying to get closer and closer towards the primary thing that's being studied or examined. Okay, so primary sources of information are oftentimes thought of as kind of first-hand accounts. They are information and material that are produced at the source, right? At the original time of the event. If we're talking about a historical event, this would include like eyewitness accounts. So if somebody is, let's say a newspaper is interviewing somebody who was a participant in an event, or if that participant wrote an email about that event, the email itself could be a primary source of information about the event. Any artifacts that are from the event are informative in a primary way about the event. If we're talking about, say, an artistic work, let's say in speech number 2, you are giving your speech on Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's play. The text of Romeo and Juliet would be, of course, a primary source of information about Romeo and Juliet. So would a actual stage production of that. So those would be primary sources. Secondary sources are one step removed from that. It could be a long period of time has passed. Perhaps a contemporary historian wants to study an event that occurred, potentially 100 years ago. They would seek out primary sources of information. They would be looking for artifacts and information produced at the time, and they would be compiling, synthesizing, analyzing, kind of comparing and contrasting the different facts or fiction of those sources are conveying. And they would all be offering some sort of value-added piece of information, a new take, a new interpretation, a new analysis of that older information. So secondary sources produce kind of value added onto the primary source. Okay. And that's kind of what separates them from tertiary sources. Tertiary sources don't really have any kind of value added. They're just regurgitating, restating what other people have said. So tertiary sources are like reference materials, encyclopedias, Wikipedia, sometimes blogs operate like tertiary sources. They're just more or less summarizing what other people, usually experts, have said in secondary source material, over here, it's backwards, or information that was gathered from primary source material. So when we're doing research, we want to move further and further down the research arrow, right? And we want to be focused primarily on secondary and primary sources of information. So for academic work and for, generally for these speeches, the better sources of information are going to be secondary and primary sources of information. And you should avoid, I would say, citing tertiary sources directly in your speeches or in your academic work, your research papers, if you're doing that. Now, your speech itself is operating a bit like a tertiary source. I'm not asking you to do any original interpretations or analysis. I'm asking you to just kind of report on what secondary sources and primary sources have provided you. Okay, so your speeches are kind of tertiary sources. And you'll be using secondary and primary sources in your speech. Okay, I hope that's helpful. You can see some examples there, and on this next slide there are other examples, and I recommend that you maybe pause the video and take a closer look, or if you go to the page in Canvas that houses this video, you can see perhaps a clearer image, this image, which is from the University of Wisconsin. And this describes some of the information types, that's what our textbook calls these things, information types and their corresponding sources. Typically, primary sources are these things, secondary sources are that column there. And then tertiary sources, you'll see like something like an abstract is usually in an academic paper. It starts with an abstract, and it's kind of like front material. And that abstract is the summary of the paper. It's not the paper itself, it's just summarizing the paper. So if you just have an abstract, you just have a tertiary source. So tertiary source is quick reference, and those can be good at the beginning of your research to help you discover search terms, to help you kind of get up to speed on the basics of the topic, and you should dig further into them. So if you're using Wikipedia, you should look at the sources, which are probably going to be secondary and primary sources of information, and you should go directly to those sources. So you can use the kind of works cited page of these things to go a little further and further down the arrow of research, that direction, right, towards your primary sources of information. I want to just give a practical kind of scenario here and also take a moment to talk a bit about source citation, right? So let me talk you through a situation that you might encounter. So this is what I'm calling a source within a source citation potentially, but let me walk you through what the process might look for you. Let's say you go to CSN Library, your speech, you're studying the War of 1812. So you're looking for primary and secondary sources of information about the War of 1812. There's not probably a whole lot of primary source information in the library, so you're mostly going to be looking at experts like Dr. Betty White. Everybody knows her, UNLV professor of history, and you find a book of hers written in 2020 called The War of 1812. Well, she's an expert. She's writing from 200 plus years after the war, so we could guess that she is a secondary source of information. She's going to add value to a bunch of primary sources that she's compiled in order to tell kind of her interpretation, her story as an expert of what happened in the War of 1812. Well, you're reading the book, and you come across an excerpt in the book, so an extended quote, a long quote in the book. And that quote, that's that little rectangle with the arrow pointing towards the diary, that quote comes from General Jack Black's 1812 diary. Okay, so the diary of General Jack Black, who's writing on, a cold, miserable morning, and he's talking about the state of his troops on the eve of a great battle. And that diary entry is a primary source of information, right? It's a kind of first-hand account of what's going on during the War of 1812. And everybody knows General Jack Black, of course, celebrated American war hero. And you are just interested in the quote, right? You're just interested in the diary entry itself. But you don't have the diary, right? You have Betty White's book, the secondary source of information. So what do? Well, if you were an historian, let's say you're a graduate student and you're writing your dissertation on the War of 1812, or you're another professor, once you've discovered through Betty White that this diary exists somewhere out there, the proper thing to do, the ethical thing to do academically, is to try to get that diary. If you want to cite the diary in your work, exclusive of what Dr. Betty White has to say about it, you're just interested in the diary, then the proper thing to do would be to go get that diary. So you do that. You spend some time searching around, trying to find where you can find maybe a PDF version of that would be great if there was some sort of scan available online, and you discover that actually you can't find one. Using the resources you have, you're unable to find it, and you're pretty certain that there's actually only one copy of the diary itself, and you know that it's in the special collections of Rutgers University in New Jersey. And the only way for you to access that would be to, get on a plane, head to New Jersey, go into the library, walk into the special collections, and ask a librarian to give you access to that diary. If you're an historian, presumably this is what Betty White did. She took a trip and she visited and she took a look at it, and that's how she was able to quote it in her book. You're unable to do that, let's say. Maybe you're a student giving a speech in Com 101. It's just not practical for you to spend your time doing that. The next best thing you can do then is to cite the secondary source. But the key here is ethically, you can't mislead your audience into thinking that you actually looked at the diary when you didn't look at the diary. And so this is where the concept of a source within a source citation comes into play. You got to be honest about what you actually looked at. And so if you want to talk about the diary, you're going to have to do so through Dr. Betty White. And not only is that ethical to do, if Betty White made a mistake, let's say she misquoted the War of 1812 diary, then that's really her fault. And by citing her, she's taking the blame, not you. So assume that she got it right, but maybe not. So it's best to just tell your audience exactly what you're doing. And so your oral citation in your speech would sound something like this. In UNLV historian Dr. Betty White's 2020 book, The War of 1812, she quotes an extended passage from General Jack Black's diary written on a cold morning in 1812. Jack Black talks about how his troops were feeling, and he says, blah, 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 blah. Okay, there's lots of different ways I could craft that oral citation, but the important part is I'm providing all the key information, right? One, I'm stating exactly what I did in my research. I had a book by Betty White. Who's Betty White? She's an historian. I want to mention that, right? When did she write the book? 2020. What's the book about? The War of 1812. And then in it, there's a diary from General Jack Black from 1812. So all the key information is provided. My audience knows exactly what's going on. It's honest, and honestly, it's boosting my own credibility. It's kind of showing my work in a way that puts my audience at ease. It's going to answer questions, how do you know that? Who said that? When did they say that? Where did they say that? Why are they credible? So pretty important there for you. So ideally, if you have the time and the resources, you want to get as close to the primary source of information as you can. We're going to call this in an upcoming video tracing, or in an upcoming set of videos when we talk about the SIFT method, finding better coverage and tracing the information back to its original context. So that's what we're doing potentially here. When we can't do that, we need to cite what we actually have and explain that up front. We don't want to make it seem like we have the diary when we don't. Same thing when you are looking at a newspaper article, let's say, something from the New York Times, and in the article, the New York Times author cites a study, a scientific study. There was a study done in 2020 that says XYZ. Rather than citing the New York Times paper, the proper thing to do would be to go to try to find that study itself, if that's all you're interested in talking about. So go back to the primary source of information, the study itself. All right. I hope that makes sense. So to summarize for you really quickly, primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, it can be hard to them, but primary sources, as we know, go as far back to the original context of that information as we can get. It's the artifact that we are examining, or it's an eyewitness account of a person who was there. So know what you have if you have a primary, secondary source of information. Use primary and secondary sources for your academic work. Both have advantages and disadvantages. Primary sources, of course, we can't have secondary sources without primary sources, and those are the eyewitnesses. Of course, eyewitnesses make mistakes. Eyewitnesses have interest or biases because they're participating in the things. So secondary sources can also be important because they can analyze, compare and contrast, and kind of add value to those primary sources. So both of them are good. Neither one of them, I would say, is necessarily better than the other. Both are important for your work. Tertiary sources are not as good, right? They are kind of flattened, remedial summaries. They often don't show their work and should be generally avoided in the publication of your work, in the citations that you're doing in your speeches. And instead, you should try to use them to help you find better primary and secondary sources. So use tertiary sources for quick reference and to guide your research process, and then trace the information back to its original source as close as you can get. That's the proper thing to do. So I hope this was helpful for you.